be notified of that. And we will get started. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Rebecca Amodeo. I am relatively new with ODE, and I'm here as the CTE data analyst. We have a few other people co-hosting this call today, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Gabby, could you get us started?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Gabby Sloss, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Education. I work on the same team as Carly, Karen, and Rebecca, and also partner with Eric regarding work-based learning and apprenticeship in CTE. Carly?
Hey everybody, I'm Carly Sitchley, and I am also on, like Gabby, on the SPST secondary post-secondary transitions team, and I work with program quality assurance for the CTE programs of study, and kind of touch on the different pieces of programs that make them high quality. Karen, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for giving us of your time this afternoon. My name is Karen Moskin. I'm a civil rights education specialist on the secondary post-secondary transitions team. And I'm going to now throw it over to Eric.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Juniman, and I'm a career connected learning specialist with the Higher Education Coordinating Commission in the Office of Community Colleges and Workforce Development, and also a member of the secondary to post-secondary transitions team, working closely on work-based learning, apprenticeship, and dual credit. And Rebecca.
Thanks for introducing yourselves, everyone. All right, I'll just briefly go over what we hope to have as your outcomes from attending this session. We hope that afterwards you'll be better equipped to hold critical conversations and take action around the work-based learning inequities that may be present in your programs. We'll do a few different things to get you there, and hopefully you'll be able to provide a more equitable foundation to work-based learning experiences. You'll be able to successfully implement the work-based learning rubric, also utilize any data tools available to you to help identify and analyze equity gaps, as well as accessing guidance and resources focused on work-based learning.
So just a couple housekeeping things as we get started. I think everybody is currently muted, and even though there's only a few of us here today, we will hope to stay that way unless you're asking questions or responding to a question. I think we've all been in enough virtual meetings now to know that this is most helpful for everyone if we keep our dogs barking and our various noises in the background out of people talking. And please enter any questions or comments that you have into the chat. Like I said, there is, you're responding to something we've asked, or the Jamboard link that Eric shared. We will monitor both and attempt to answer questions as they arise. And at the end, we have built-in time for answering additional questions. If there's anything we can't answer this afternoon, we will find an answer and follow up with an email for you. And last but most important, please take care of you. We're nearing the end of the day, so everyone is tired. And we recognize that these aren't traditional meeting spaces and there are distractions. So please feel free to engage to whatever extent your environment requires.
All right, so today's training is both grounded in the framework provided by ODE's equity stance that you'll see here, as well as the application that Oregon's equity lens offers to our CTE programs of study and our broader education systems. So we'll be utilizing both of those today. And I'm going to turn it over to Gabby to talk a little bit more about the equity stance.
Thanks, Eric. If you aren't all familiar with the equity stance from ODE, it's important for us to know that we at ODE, and I know most of our schools across the state do this, always centering our work in equity through the practices and procedures we have. so that policies, legislation, and resource allocation are addressing students. Students are at the center. Of note is educational rigor and opportunities for historically and currently marginalized youth. And the last sentence that I will call your attention to is important, as it calls out that we currently have systems in place that create barriers to equity, and these must be dismantled and restructured in ways that do not discriminate. I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk a little bit more about what that looks like, especially at HEC and the equity lens. Eric?
Thanks, Gabby. So the equity lens, Oregon's equity lens, what this does is really provides you a tool. This has been around a while now, I think 2017 at least, as I recall. So you've probably seen this. So this is really, though, a tool that can give you critical foundational questions to be asking when you're designing new work-based learning experiences and programming. You're considering your work-based learning processes, reviewing your work-based learning data, and facilitating work-based learning opportunities and partnerships. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to Karen.
Karen, we can't.
Karen, you're not muted.
You're muted, Karen.
You're on, yeah, sorry about that.
Thought I would make it through without that. Sorry, thank you very much. I was really sounding smart for a while there. Anyway, just wanted to remind you that work-based learning is a school experience, and as such, it still falls under civil rights obligations. And we want to make sure that we're not discriminating against students. And so we've included the discrimination definition that's in statute for Oregon, which talks to us about that it's any act that unreasonably differentiates treatment. And then these two words, intended or unintended, are really important, because quite often folks will say, but that wasn't how we meant it. It wasn't what we meant to happen, which is absolutely true. I don't believe that anyone intends harm to any students. But what we need to look at is the impact of what our actions may or may not have on others. For example, if we're just in a car accident, let's say that a car accidentally hits us and we break our leg, then at that time, it doesn't really matter if they meant to hit us or not, but instead we need to be sure to address the impact of that and address what harm there has that's been done. And in this case, we're talking about anything that is discriminatory in operation, which is based on the 9 or 10 protected classes in Oregon now, because we've just added a new one: age, disability, national origin, race, color, marital status, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and now gender identity is also officially a protected class in Oregon. The next slide talks to us about when it comes to Perkins, then we also have some additional populations that we consider to make sure that our students are all being represented. And you'll note that there are some that are bolded here, and that's because they've changed since Perkins 4, so that with Perkins 5, they were added on to have homeless individuals, youth who are in or have aged out of foster care systems, or youth with parents in active duty or in the armed forces. So now we're going to pass it on to Carly and Rebecca to talk to us about equity with data analysts.
Thanks, Karen. All right. So first, we will get started in this conversation with our data analysis discussion with some state level CTE work-based learning information from our most recent school year, the 2020-2021 school year. That was the first year that ODE collected these data, and we now collect this work-based learning data as part of our updated federal reporting responsibilities under Perkins 5. So what are we looking at in this slide? We've got a 6-column graph, and it's showing the estimates of CTE work-based learning participation rates across various student groups. Each column shows its own proportion of the student group that has either 0, 1, or more than 1 CTE work-based learning experiences in that school year. A note about all the student counts that went into this graph is that all the student group counts I'm about to reference come from a group of Oregon high school students that are in schools that offer state-approved CTE programs of study. So it's not limited just to the students who enrolled in those CTE courses, but it doesn't compare, or it doesn't include student counts from schools that don't offer CTE. So I'll go through the columns here left to right, give you a better sense of what we have. First column on the left represents the overall student body. The second column represents our female students, and the third represents our gender non-binary students. We can see representation in the fourth column for the students in racial or ethnic minority groups. The fifth column, second from the right, represents students served under Section 504. And the column on the far right, the sixth column, represents students with IEPs. So you'll notice, first of all, that an individual student may appear in more than one of these student groups. These are not, obviously, these aren't groups that are exclusive of each other across the board. All right, so those are the columns, and onto the color coding of these 3 stacked sections in each column. The yellow or bottom section shows what proportion of the students in that group had multiple CTE work-based learning experiences. So they engaged in more than one. The teal or middle section shows what proportion of students in that group had exactly one CTE work-based learning experience. And the purple or the top section indicates what proportion of students in that group did not have any CTE work-based learning in the school year. So these estimates are at the state level. There may be significant differences in your own school or district from what you're seeing on this simple graph that has all the different areas all rolled up into one category. And another note is that these are some preliminary estimates. The official results of these work-based learning engagements will come out in the 90% report in a few months. Oh, can you go back to that last slide? Sorry, haven't gotten to the best part yet. I did mention that last year was the first year we collected these data, and I know that a lot of people worried that their school or programs struggle to provide work-based learning opportunities in the pandemic might affect our state's ability to meet our federal reporting target. So I'm glad to say that we met and exceeded our state's target of 5% engagement. You can see here on the graph, there is a dot dash line running horizontally across all the columns. And this line shows where the 5% engagement level lives on this graph. You can see in every one of the student groups represented here, the bottom section extends higher than the 5% line. So not only did we meet the 5% participation target within each group, but more than 5% in each of these student groups had multiple work-based learning experiences. So fun note also about this is that each of these student groups also show that most students who had CTE work-based learning had more than one work-based learning experience. And you can see that by the bottom or yellow section being larger than the middle section in each column. So we hadn't really anticipated that, wouldn't have guessed it, but Carly and I were pleasantly surprised when that insight came through in the numbers. And my point is here that we did it. We exceeded the target for CTE work-based learning despite the difficulties of the pandemic. And while collecting this info is new, the work-based learning itself has been and continues to be a part of your programs. So we did it, we're going to keep doing it, yep. And now we get to further develop the equity and access to our program offerings. we will, oh, sorry, lost my slide. All right. No, I'm sorry, you were doing great. Yeah, go back to that data analysis slide. My screen prints out, sorry. So we will, this is some of the stuff that's going to be covered in today's work-based learning data and equity training. We're going to look at the different types of data that you'll be relying on, how you're collecting it, and talk about what different groups of students may be affected by different policies and programs, or who you may or may not be getting enough information from when you collect your data. Talk about root cause analysis. And while this term may be a little unfamiliar, this is a set of processes that will that I'm sure you've engaged with before, part of interrogating the reasons behind the numbers that you're seeing when you look at your data. And we'll also talk about some of the foundational resources that you have at your disposal. We've already covered a bit about the Oregon Equity Lens and the ODE Equity Stance, but you'll see as we move forward that this isn't a solo endeavor. You're not doing it alone. You can't do it alone. You're part of a larger team here with the state, with the people in your programs and schools, and with us here at the state administration level. And we'll talk also about some of the things to look out for when you engage with your foundational resources. Now I'll hand it over to Carly to talk a little bit about what data we're using.
Yeah, so thinking about the data that you have available to you, and what a powerful tool it can be, and what it can, how it can support what you're observing or what the students are experiencing in the programs or at school. Here are just a couple basic examples of data that are available, and thinking about what data you're relying on for growing work-based learning opportunities. So enrollment data is listed here as a potential school level data source that is available to you. And something as simple as enrollment data is really key to checking and supporting observations or thoughts about inequities in the class or school or programs. And basic enrollment data can help with identifying disparities such as who's accessing programs or classes or a work-based learning opportunity, who's signing up for programs, and then who actually makes it past just one or two classes, who's missing from your classes or programs or opportunities. And have these disparities been happening for just like one term or one semester, or have they been happening for a while? So how long have these disparities been going on for? And that's a lot of things that you can find out, or questions you can help answer with just basic enrollment data. And there are a lot of other resources that are available. The participation information, attendance is, I think, I'm guessing because I can't see your attendance information, but a pretty available resource to you. And then what else is there, like at the district level and at the state level? And at the state level, there's things like the 90% reports or the stoplight report. If you don't have access on the district website to the 90% report, there are the REL trainings, REL Regional Education Laboratory, that people can get access to. The Participation Explorer website, which I will put in the link in the chat in a moment. So those are just a few of the resources that might be helpful, and just ideas of data that could be used to help you look at the work-based learning opportunities and try to make decisions going forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. And coming up with all these questions is great. And you might find that there are questions you can't answer because you don't have data that helps answer those, or the data sorry. So having questions that you can't answer when you're looking at your data isn't a bad thing. It just means that you need to think about how you're collecting data and how else you could collect data. So how could you get that data? Who can help access it? And remembering that data doesn't have to be just numbers, that it can be surveys and voices and interviews or focus groups talking with not just students, but who else you can talk with, like families, business and industry partners. Really just a reminder that when you're collecting data, you don't have to just look at the numbers, but there are a lot of other ways to help you get the data, and a lot of other sources besides numbers that can be beneficial to think about and consider in your data collections.
Thanks, Carly. All right, so we've Carly mentioned some of the different existing sources that you may already have for the data you look at, and some ideas on how to get more information. Just circle back to this root cause analysis that will be going in depth more in the rest of this conversation. So again, root cause analysis might be kind of a new term, but it's just a set of processes that you and your team can use for getting to the core of where mismatches come between the theory or plans and the application of providing work-based learning. Getting to the root of questions like, what does the data tell you? Talk about how to examine what the data tells you, and think about what the barriers are to more equitable outcomes that you would be able to also measure with your data. As Karen mentioned, identifying disparities is not the same as looking for intentional discrimination. This is about the impact on student experience. I'll hand it back over to Carly to talk a little bit more about the team.
So we gave you a little bit of information about the data that you have available to you, or what data you can use, as well as thinking about how to collect data, and then what to kind of do with the data, and then who's looking at the data. So earlier, Rebecca mentioned that you're not alone in this. So who's your team? Who are you utilizing to help you make decisions with the data that you have come up with, or the data that you would like to collect? And so there are a lot of people that would be really beneficial to think about and get voices from as you start utilizing and considering the data. Student voice, students are, they know. So including students and in the data that you're looking at would be great. Teachers, counselors, admin, everybody that's listed here would be helpful as you're creating a team to think about the data and what to do with it. They are all their own subject matter experts and have really beneficial opinions that they can offer and help you move the data into making new opportunities. Now Gabby's going to talk about the work-based learning rubric.
Thanks, Carly and Rebecca, for talking about useful steps for data analysis when working with different sources of data and how to look at it through an equity lens or an equitable process. Now I'm just going to touch on and talk about another useful tool that you can use in your data analysis, which is Introduction to the Work-Based Learning Rubric. Hopefully, many of you have become familiar with where to find the rubric. I believe Carly will be putting a link in the chat for you all. But on the Oregon Department of Education's website, we have a career and technical education webpage. And from there, you can find career connected learning and everything from the career connected learning framework to the Perkins 5 work-based learning handbook and the work-based learning rubric. Here is just an overall overview of the work-based learning criteria and other quality experience indicators for when yourself, a CTE teacher, maybe a work-based learning coordinator, or even just your CTE partners to refer to and use when setting up work-based learning experiences for your students. One of the criteria that is mentioned here is equity considerations, which we've pulled up here on your screen, that touches on putting students at the center of this experience in ways that is being done currently, but also hopefully what you're seeing are ways to look at your experiences through an equity lens. And ensure that these considerations are made when working with your partners and working to ensure that students are getting the most value out of their experience. What we're looking at here is that we don't expect everyone to be at level 4. That is a great long-term vision and aspiring to, if you will. But again, this is also just a self-assessment. It's a program assessment. It is looking at what you currently do, or maybe what you're trying to do, thinking about how to start this process. And you will find ways, and what we will touch on here in a few minutes, and Karen will go through, are what we heard from a lot of your colleagues and you here in the room today about equity issues and work-based learning, everything from transportation, scheduling, who's ensuring students to get placed into work-based learning experiences, what's the decision-making process like? And of course, what are the processes in terms of, is there an application or selection process? It doesn't stop there, but those were the key ones that we heard from you all in the field over the last year. And again, this is why we're having the PD today. So I'm gonna we're gonna get into that section of the conversation now and turn it on over to Karen. Karen, take it away.
Thanks, Gabby. So yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you for all of the great benefits that you listed on the Jamboard. When I was looking at those, I saw some of the things like it helps students stay engaged. It provides a system of networking. It helps to bring theory into practice. It helps students to meet employers and make those connections. So that and many, many other benefits that are really important. And so as such, it's real important that we make sure that all students have access to these wonderful benefits that work-based learning provides. So there are a few foundational equity considerations like Gabby was talking about that we would like you to consider for your programs. The first one is, do all students have equitable access to work-based learning experiences? The second would be, are students at the center of the decision processes that you have in place? And then the third would be, do biases of decision makers or systemic issues within your system or institution impact participation? And today we're going to be talking about those 4 areas that Gabby pointed out are in the rubric: transportation, scheduling, application and selection, and opportunity for student voice. Not to say that these are the only equity considerations, but as Gabby mentioned, these were what continually came up from folks as areas that they wanted to focus on. So we want to just be able to put it all together. We've heard about how we can look at different types of data, that it doesn't have to just be numbers, but also to make sure that we're providing voice of students and community and their family within that information that we're collecting. Once we do all of that, then we can identify an issue that is impacting equity do that root cause analysis that Rebecca talked about, and then that will help us to determine the action that needs to be made in order to provide a more equitable situation for our students to have experiences. So the first one then to consider is, does transportation create barriers for some students in order to get access to work-based learning? So some questions to think about are, who is providing the transportation in a work-based learning experience? Are there alternative means of transportation that you could capitalize on? Or are there alternative locations or even modalities for experiences? So we're going to look at a few scenarios. Let's look at one now for transportation. In this scenario, the school talked to us and said that their school provided experiences for 5 students who can provide their own transportation to work in a dairy before school. So the consideration here is, do students all have opportunities for access to this work-based learning experience? So what I would like you to do is either unmute yourselves and explain to us, or else put in the chat which groups of students would potentially not be able to participate in this scenario.
So you want us to talk?
Yes, please do, Rebecca.
Obviously, students who don't have their own ability to transport.
Exactly. And so that can be students without cars, students who don't yet have a driver's license. It can be students who are required to take care of siblings in the morning before school. It can be all kinds of situations where there are particular students that would never have that opportunity. Yep, those without personal or family transportation, unstable housing, absolutely, familiar restraints. You're on it. You all have hit it exactly. You've nailed it. So here are some of the things that some schools are doing to help respond to the situations when they've been identified. Some have provided bus passes or other means of public transportation. Some actually have a trailer or some other means that they use to bring the lab to the students at school. Some bring the employers to the school, or others provide virtual experiences in school. Are there any others that you have done or that you're aware of that folks have been doing to help alleviate the strains or the stress of not providing transportation? Okay, we're going to move to the next one, but I know that we have a lot of schools who are really working hard to make sure that they're finding equitable means to make sure that their students can participate. And so we really appreciate the efforts that we hear about and that we see that are happening out there. So the other question that we want to talk about is scheduling. As we heard in the last question, that time in the morning was problematic for quite a few students that maybe had other family obligations or something like that. Are there other current practices within your system that are creating barriers for students? So maybe it's pull-out classes. Maybe there are limited opportunities for work-based learning. Perhaps it's the biases of staff or counselors who are involved in the process, or the lack of information for those scheduling. A lot of times when we visit schools, we find out that when the scheduling takes place, it often is in a student's homeroom class. And so they're working with their homeroom teacher who may or may not know even about work-based learning opportunities or about CTE classes in general. So providing information to all of those who are involved in scheduling can really make a big difference when it comes to making sure that students are aware of opportunities. So here's a scenario that has involved using data like we've been talking about today. So in this scenario, the school provided work-based learning experiences for students during their 3rd year of a CTE class. In a review of the data, they found that there were no students with disabilities or English learner students participating in that work-based learning experience. what might be the reason for that? What would potentially be some of the root causes for why we would not have representation from either of these protected classes? Struggling students oftentimes lose class time for other classes. Exactly. So that's a really important one that Sherry just talked about. Another one is that sometimes the way that schools schedule things, then they require pull-out classes for students to receive extra services. Or they may say that we only are having 6 courses or 6 classes in a day, and 5 of those 6 are required, and so there's only space for 1 elective, and that 1 elective is going to be taken up by English learner students or students with disabilities. And then they would never have the opportunity, even if they eventually were not in that pull-out class any longer, they would not ever have the opportunity to be in the 3rd year of a CTE class in order to be able to experience that work-based learning. So not having that opportunity ever because of the way that the system is set up and the way that the school does that. The other question is, how are students and families being informed about opportunities within your schools? Are they only being told about it with students finding out about it during their CTE class? Or is it something that's we let all of the community know about? So again, how are we informing about those opportunities? Is it just an announcement in a college and career center? Or is it getting out to everyone? Because families can have a huge influence on students and participation in work-based learning. Another great question from Denise is communication only in English or only digital? And that's really important when we talk about the digital divide or whether or not it's available in the languages of your community. So Sherry's saying these are easy to identify, but hard to overcome. And that's right. So we need to think about, are we having work-based learning during class time as well? And if so, then how are we making sure that students have access to our classes? Because again, if there are barriers in place for scheduling, then they're not even making it into the CTE classes. Okay, next one. So what some schools are doing is providing push-in models for English learners and special education services that don't require pulling students out of much class time. They're providing multiple work-based learning experiences throughout the school day. They're training staff members to recognize and eliminate implicit bias, and are also communicating those work-based learning experiences to all students and families in the languages of the communities. So you really did all nail those. So that was a great job. So we're next going to think about the application process, because quite often when there are just a limited number of slots or spaces available, then the application process can sometimes create a barrier that impacts only specific groups of students, and especially some of our protected classes. So we're going to look at a couple of different scenarios in this section to talk about how that has happened. So this next slide is a scenario that says that the school is providing an opportunity to work with an employer from Microsoft. And in an effort to make sure that the students that are representing the school represent well, the application has the following prerequisites. The student must have a GPA of 3.5 or higher. A teacher recommendation is required, and an essay explaining why students want to participate is required for the application. So in this particular scenario, who would not be provided access to this course and probably would not even apply? So if we think about some of these, how many of our students are familiar with the teachers in order to ask for that teacher recommendation? Or how many students have a GPA of 3.5 or higher? Or how many are comfortable writing an essay? The question that we need to ask is, how do the requirements for this work-based learning experience directly relate to that experience. So how do those requirements that we have here for this application relate to being able to work with that Microsoft employer? What are the things that are necessary in order to do the work with that employer? And if they're not directly related to that experience, then we need to double check and make sure that we're not just putting into place something that's serving as a filtering process and making it so that we're eliminating students who could learn a great deal from having this experience. Here's one more. Our industry partner has some very strict requirements for who they allow into work-based learning at their business. They don't want students with disabilities or students who speak English with an accent because it may bother their customers. Is it okay for us to provide a different experience for those students? So what I would like us to consider is when we think about at the very beginning when we were talking about that definition of discrimination, and we talked about different treatment on the basis of specific protected classes, of which disabilities and national origin, which is students who speak something other than English or maybe with an accent, would both be a protected class that we don't want to treat differently. So it's very, very important that we realize that our business partners must agree not to discriminate. This is a school-based activity, and so it needs to be as it would be if a student was at school. And so it's a real important piece that when you have agreements with employers, that you make sure that they understand that they won't discriminate and that they sign on a notice saying that they will not discriminate against our students on the basis of those protected classes. So I love what Denise said with rethink that industry partner. Yeah, I love, would anyone really want to work with such a bigoted employer? You might be surprised. Sometimes people are thinking we're really desperate to provide situations for our students. And so they do. And so I love that all of you are saying, no, we're not going to work with an employer who's going to discriminate against our students. Because what kind of an experience will they be providing for our students? And would that be a safe environment for them to be in, regardless of the protected class they were in? So thank you very much. So here are some other barrier considerations that we've run into when it comes to applications or prerequisites. There are some that are attendance requirements, math requirements. We talked about letters of recommendation, disciplinary actions, or where or when they've been given to students. Again, only available in one specific language, English, or anyone who's involved in registration not being aware of those offerings. So what some schools have done in order to help with some of these barriers are that they have been looking over and ensuring that all recruitment application and enrollment processes are super transparent. They're available in the languages of the community and available for all students to have access to. They're reviewing the prerequisites for courses and taking a step back, because sometimes something that's been there for 15 or 20 years, you don't recognize what kind of barriers it might be creating. So to take a step back and look at it with new eyes from the viewpoint of a student and looking for courses and work-based learning experiences and make sure that they don't serve as a barrier for participation, and then remove any of those that are not specific to the experience that we're discussing. Others have been holding lottery drawings for very competitive slots. Are there any others that you're aware of or that you've used? So Sherry says she loves the lottery drawings idea, so great. Yep, I know that there are quite a few schools who are doing that right now, so that's great. The last one that we're going to be talking about today is whether or not you're able to include student voice. So we heard Carly and Rebecca both referring to the importance of including our student voice in the decisions that we make. So how does your school or district involve students in your decisions and analysis? Are you including them from all of the special populations within Perkins 5 or from all of the protected classes that are represented at your school? Some of the ways to do that are through some of the things that we heard Carly talking about, but also additional student surveys or focus groups. Some focus groups might be for students who maybe signed up for the class, but then dropped out, or it might be asking students who applied, but then couldn't get in, weren't able to participate. So finding out from them what were the reasons why they couldn't get in, or finding out from counselors how that was happening. It's sometimes really interesting to see what students believe are the reasons why they didn't get into a course versus what counselors will say for the reasons why somebody doesn't get into a course or can't participate in a specific work-based learning activity. So different focus groups and ways to get information from students and giving them voice is very, very important in the ways that we run things, and also reaching out to their communities and families as well. So some of the things that you might learn by doing that are on the next slide, which are here are some suggested questions, but I can tell you that we're going to, at the very end, give you a few resources, and one of those resources really gives you a real long list of some great questions to ask in order to be able to include student voice in the decisions that you make. So one of the questions that I really like to ask students is number 6, which is, if you could change one thing about this experience, what would it be? And quite often we learn some real interesting things when students tell us about what they would do if they had the power to make change within our systems. So the next slide then are some final recommendations. And that is for us to remember to always place learners at the center of our decisions and consider who will not be able to participate with the current structures that we have in place. Be willing to step back, like we said, and have those conversations that challenge the status quo or the way that things have been done for a long time or have always been done. And afford all of our students the dignity of access to pathways that lead to high wage, high demand opportunities. So we're now going to turn the time back over to Gabby and Eric, who are going to talk about putting it all together again and bringing us back to the rubric.
Thanks, Karen. So as we bring it back around to looking at this graphic that was created, you'll see here again that in all of the scenarios and conversations that Karen started and had with everyone today, students are always being kept in the center when trying to create equitable work-based learning experiences, which include looking at scheduling, transportation, access in registration or selection protocols, in addition to including student voice. And I just wanted to say thank you, Sherry, for the comments that you made, always working with those stigmas and myths or biases, especially from those adults closest to students, including their parents or a coach. So those are all great examples, again, of some of the barriers that unfortunately we get to work through that our students here and have to work through during their days. So, and again, hopefully you'll see, and we did a deeper dive into those conversations today, or those equity considerations, and hopefully gives you a better idea about how to think about utilizing the rubric, especially the equity considerations portion of that work. And so I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca to just talk about some resources and next steps. Rebecca.
Thanks, Gabby. All right, so we have posted several links in the chat to the CTE workbook, CTE Work-Based Learning Handbook, the CTE Work-Based Learning Rubric, the REL data dashboard. There's lots of links that we've posted there, and we'll post those again in a moment. We also have, we'll be including now a link to a rubric support tool That's a compilation of the equity questions and considerations outlined in the rubric and discussed today that Karen walked us through, like the transportation, scheduling and enrollment, application and selection, and student voice. You'll also have links to these tools and strategies you see on the slide now. A couple different toolkits, some videos explaining some different approaches to the root cause analysis. And you can stick around. We have a little more time left in our scheduled meeting. Please stay and ask your questions if you have any about the work-based learning rubric or work-based learning opportunities and equity, about data collection and the work-based learning for CTE programs. Definitely feel free to get all those other questions addressed now. Thank you from all of us who presented today. We're really happy to have your attention and your participation on this topic. You can see here, and these slides will end up being available. You can reach out to any of us by email if you have remaining questions or questions that pop up later. So thanks again. We're going to stop the recording now and go into the